Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Eric Mann. I'm working at the Food and Drug Administration, and it's really a pleasure to be here today and to participate in this workshop on healthy aging and hearing loss. And I've really enjoyed the presentations to date, and thank you, Cynthia, for that very nice overview of current technology. So we're going to shift gears a little bit now and talk about FDA regulation of hearing aids and the requirements. And hopefully, I'm going to keep this at a very high level. I'm going to have to keep it at a high level given that I only have 15 minutes. And I vow that I will try to keep the regulatory speak to a minimum and try to keep this accessible to people. I will try to do the 30,000-foot approach to regulation, essentially. So I'll start off by doing an overview of device regulations and how we use a risk-based approach in regulating medical devices. And then I'll cone in on hearing aids in particular. And hearing aids are kind of a unique device. There's a handful of devices at FDA that actually have their own kind of regulations apart from the classification regulation that are intended to ensure safety and effectiveness. And hearing aids happen to be one of those. We have a specific regulation regarding labeling and one for conditions for sale. And I will talk about those and the reason that we have those regulations. So just at the very 30,000-foot level, within FDA, we have an Office of Medical Products and Tobacco. And within that office are 4 centers. There's certainly the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. They regulate drugs. We have a Center for Biologics. We have a relatively recently created Center for Tobacco Products. But I work in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And of course, hearing aids and the regulation of auditory type devices are within that center. I would point out that the regulations for all of these centers, particularly the first 3, are pretty much geared towards ensuring safety and effectiveness, although the specific regulations across centers do vary. And today I will be speaking from a CDRH or a Center for Devices perspective. Okay, so FDA derives its regulatory authority to oversee the safety and effectiveness of medical devices from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And we have a very clear definition as to what constitutes a medical device. And I have it listed here in bullet form. Essentially, it's any product that is intended to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease or condition, or is intended to affect the structure or function of the body, and it does not achieve its intended use through chemical action or metabolism. And as you can imagine, this last bullet about chemical action and metabolism is what separates devices from biologics and drugs. Okay, so a device should not act through chemical action or metabolism. This is a very broad definition, but it does draw a bright line between things that are medical devices and those that aren't. And I think it's particularly relevant to the discussion that we've had about PSAPs off and on throughout the workshop so far. So I just want to highlight that clearly a hearing aid is a product that is intended to treat or mitigate hearing loss and is thus very clearly a medical device. Whereas a PSAP, or a personal sound amplification product, in FDA's view, is a product that's meant to be used by normally hearing people under certain listening conditions. The Walker game ear for hunters being a good example. That is not treating a condition or preventing or mitigating or treating a disease or condition. Okay, that's normally hearing individuals. Nor is it affecting the structure or function of the body. It's providing amplified sound to the auditory system. So we do have this distinction, again, between a hearing aid, which treats hearing impaired consumers of any degree, and that this includes mild hearing loss, moderate, severe. Okay, any product that is intended to mitigate or treat a hearing loss is considered a hearing aid in FDA's view, whereas a PSAP is for normally hearing individuals. Okay, there's been a lot, just as a tangential point, we've had a guidance document now that's tried to make this clarification. We recently updated that guidance document in draft form at least, with some specific examples to kind of clarify the types of claims that would be more associated with hearing aids and PSAPs. And I just want to emphasize this is not like a change in FDA policy or a new FDA standard. This is merely us trying to clarify for manufacturers, for consumers, for practitioners, the distinction between a hearing aid and a personal sound amplification product. And I'm sure we'll have some questions and discussion about that later, but I just wanted to start with that. So this definition, though, is wide, as it's stated, and this slide kind of illustrates the huge diversity of medical devices that FDA oversees. And it includes everything from something as simple as a tongue depressor or a Band-Aid on the left-hand side, all the way through things like tanning beds and breast implants down below here. Again, these are structure function type devices, and that's how they meet the definition. You wouldn't consider a tanning bed necessarily treating a disease, but it does affect the structure of the body, so it does meet the device definition. And then certainly at the other end of the spectrum, we have very sophisticated high-risk type devices like neurostimulators, artificial hearts, pacemakers, and so forth. So how does FDA approach the regulation of such a wide variety of medical devices? And the answer is it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, okay? Certainly you wouldn't expect to randomize controlled trials for a new tongue blade that's coming on the market. On the other, well, maybe some people would, but FDA does not. On the other hand, when you're developing a new neurostimulator or an artificial heart or a heart valve, you would want a well-designed clinical trial to establish safety and effectiveness. So the answer as to how we regulate this wide variety of devices is that when the medical device amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act were enacted back in 1976, it created a risk-based classification, okay, in which the regulatory requirements were actually gauged to the risk posed by the device. So we have three classes of devices: Class 1, which are considered low risk, Class 2 of moderate risk, and Class 3 high risk. So the regulatory requirements, again, are gauged according to the risk level. So in Class 1, we have regulatory or general controls which are intended to ensure safety and effectiveness of the device. And I will go into more detail as to what that means exactly, general controls. But these are basically the baseline level of regulatory requirements that apply across all device types. When we move up a notch to the moderate risk level, we feel that general controls in and of themselves are not sufficient to ensure safety and effectiveness of the device. So we feel that additional special controls are needed. And a special control can be something like a performance standard, like an ANSI standard or an ISO standard or performance standard that the device would have to meet. It could be something like a guidance document that FDA has created that outlines certain points that need to be addressed in a pre-market submission. Or it could even be something like a post-market surveillance requirement, like a registry or a device tracking mechanism. And then finally, at the far end of the spectrum, when we have Class 3 devices, the high-risk devices, general controls, again, are not sufficient to ensure safety and effectiveness. So we have the pre-market approval process, and you may be familiar with that. This is a very in-depth pre-market application, including all sorts of information on the manufacturing, on preclinical studies, and usually the centerpiece of a PMA is a very well-designed clinical study, well-controlled study, and there's typically even an outline of a plan for a post-market study as well. Okay, so that's at the high end, the Class 3 devices. So again, we have a risk-based classification. One size does not fit all. So how do hearing-related devices kind of fit into this overall scheme of things? I've kind of outlined specific hearing devices and where they fit into the classification. Your typical air conduction hearing aid, which we've talked a lot about during the workshop here, is a Class 1 device. So it's considered, in essence, a low-risk device. Class 2, we have things like bone-anchored hearing aids, the Baha, tinnitus maskers. We have wireless air conduction hearing aids, and I should point out it's not that the risk of a wireless hearing aid is significantly different than an air conduction hearing aid from a safety standpoint. It's more in terms of the regulatory controls that we need to ensure effectiveness because of wireless interference, EMC issues, and so forth. FDA has felt that those are important enough that we do need special controls to assure that those devices will be effective in those situations, and labeling and everything else that goes along with that. In the class 3, the high-risk type of auditory devices, we have things like cochlear implants, as you might imagine. We have certain implantable middle ear hearing devices, the most recent being the Envoy device, which some of you might be familiar with, a totally implantable middle ear hearing device, and things like auditory brainstem implants. So again, we have the complete spectrum of devices within hearing-related technologies. Okay, so now getting back to the class 1 garden variety air conduction hearing aid, and that's really kind of the focus of this workshop, so that's kind of where I'm going to spend most of my time in terms of the kind of regulatory controls that we have in place for those technologies. So again, they are class 1 devices, and FDA has determined that general controls in and of themselves are sufficient to ensure safety and effectiveness of the air conduction hearing aid device type. Okay, so what are general controls? I have them listed here on the side in bulleted form. The first is prohibition of adulterated or misbranded devices, and again, kind of diluting this down to layman speak, it essentially means that the labeling for the device should be truthful and accurate and not false or misleading. Okay. We have a quality system regulation, and good manufacturing practices are also one of the general controls as well. There are some baseline requirements for manufacturers to register their facilities with FDA and to list the types of devices that they are marketing. There are various record-keeping requirements. There are some provisions regarding repair, replacement, or refund, but these are very rarely come into play. And when the medical device amendments were first enacted back in 1976, there was a requirement for pre-market notification, also known as a 510K, which you may have heard of. But as of the late 1990s, most Class 1 devices are now actually exempt from that requirement for a pre-market notification. So as long as they comply with the preceding general controls, an air conduction hearing aid typically would not have to have a pre-market application to FDA. The exception would be if there's a fundamental change in technology to the hearing aid, or if the hearing aid is being indicated for a new population. That would kind of what we call exceed the limitations of the exemption, and it would in fact require a 510K. But most 510K devices are now exempt, including most air conduction hearing aids. Okay, so now I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, in addition to the general controls, hearing aids are a little unique in terms of having a specific regulation regarding their labeling and conditions for sale. So we'll talk a little bit about that right now. But I do want to emphasize that most air conduction hearing aids are not prescription devices. So that is a type of restriction that we have for some devices, prescription versus over-the-counter or non-prescription devices. But in general, most air conduction hearing aids are not prescription devices. However, they are restricted by regulation with respect to labeling and with respect to conditions for sale. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. So here's the restriction, the regulation regarding labeling, and it's 21 CFR 420. There is a requirement within this labeling regulation for the manufacturer to develop a user instructional brochure, and it outlines the content of that brochure within the regulation. And in particular, there has to be very well-defined instructions for use. This includes like a diagram with all of the different components and functionalities of the hearing aid described, how to insert the battery, remove the battery, how to maintain the hearing aid, conditions to avoid damaging the hearing aid, those kinds of things, as well as expectations that a hearing aid, the air conduction hearing aid, will not restore normal hearing.
and that to get the most out of a hearing aid, this is only part of an oral rehabilitation program that you may need. Optimally, you would have clinician involvement as well to kind of fine-tune the hearing aid. So these are in the user instructional brochure. There's a section called Warning to Hearing Aid Dispensers, and this outlines what we call the so-called red flag signs and symptoms. These include things like draining from the ear, asymmetric hearing loss, that sort of thing. And these are flags that the hearing aid dispenser needs to actually go and refer to a physician. In addition to that, we also have an important notice for prospective hearing aid users. This describes the whole conditions for sale process of need for and necessity for a medical evaluation. And there's also a technical performance data section as well, as defined by the ANSI standard. The other regulation is a conditions for sale regulation, and it essentially requires a medical evaluation by a licensed physician within 6 months of dispensing that hearing aid. There is a provision available for a waiver for users greater than 18 years of age, as long as the patient signs a statement acknowledging it's not in their best health interest, and the dispenser may not encourage the waiver, and the dispenser should afford them an opportunity to review the user instructional brochure as well. And there are some record-keeping requirements. So these are the conditions for sale. Just to emphasize the reason for that, both of these regulations are the outcome of an interdepartmental task force back in the mid-1970s and some Senate hearings, which were looking into the suboptimal diagnosis and treatment of hearing disorders prior to dispensing a hearing aid. So it's essentially, again, the medical evaluation requirement that we described is not based on the safety issue with the hearing aid. It's more about recognizing medically and surgically treatable causes of hearing loss and providing optimal hearing health care for patients. And that's pretty much it. I just want to point out that we do have some very good resources online available if you're interested in hearing aid regulation, and my contact information as well if you have any questions. Thank you.